We now move on to the rural areas of the period under study. And first, let us talk about how did the common people view the king. Now, commoners have left behind almost no records. Most of the information that we get are from oral traditions like the Panchatantra and the Jataka stories. So your text mentions the Gandatindu Jataka, which talks about a king who, changes, who sort of goes out to the villages in disguise to find out how his subjects are faring. And when he goes from village to village, every category of people, whether it's old people, children, young people who are working in the fields, men or women, even animals, they all complain to the king that, of course, not knowing that he's the king, but they all complain that we are robbed by the robbers at night, but the king's tax collectors come and rob us during the daytime. So obviously they were protesting the taxes, which were much hated. And the same Jataka also talks about how the peasants then ran away, from their fields, abandoned their fields, and went and hid in forests. So this is also a very interesting, idea that gets thrown up, that the peasants did not always have very direct ways of protest, but abandoning your fields and hiding in the forest was actually very powerful, because if they leave their agrarian fields, there is no production. So where is the king going to get his taxes from? So the king had to be careful about how much taxes he was forcing the people to pay. Of course, one of the methods, as you saw, of the peasants for avoiding taxes was running away. But often peasants were also looking at strategies to increase production so that they could pay the taxes better. The first among that is introduction of plough agriculture in the Gangetic Plains, though hoe agriculture continued in the more arid and hilly areas. Now, the iron tipped plough was also a great innovation, because when you look at the soil in the Gangetic Plains, the soil tends to get very hard in the dry months. And it's actually in the dry months that the farmers are supposed to plough their fields. So, the iron tipped plough became heavy and was able to turn the soil better. Helping increase fertility of the soil and therefore yield. Transplantation of paddy was another excellent innovation. This made sure that the paddy plants had a better chance of survival and therefore increasing the yield of rice. The fourth strategy was, of course, irrigation through wells, tanks, and canals. And we also see that, often the ruling dynasties would also help in building and repairing tanks and canals, because tanks and canals were huge projects which individuals or even small village groups found it difficult to undertake. So we have references, quite a few inscriptions that we find around the country, which talk about one king getting a tank constructed or a canal constructed, and maybe many generations later by a king of another dynasty, that tank or that canal is repaired. So we see how important irrigation was in Indian agriculture. Now, we've talked about these new technologies, and we also know that technology always results in unequal benefits. So some farmers were able to gain more from these technical innovations than other farmers, which therefore led to differences in rural societies. So when we look at Buddhist texts, it talks about three categories of peasants: the landless laborers, the small landholders, and the large landholders. Now, the Buddhist texts use a term called Gahapati to signify any landholder or householder. When we look at the Sangam texts, they also mention three categories of rural population: the Adimai or the slaves, the Uzavar or the plowmen, and the Velalars or the landowners. Now, let's look at land grants and how that creates a new rural elite. Now, we have a lot of copper plate and stone inscriptions which mark out land grants. Often, these inscriptions are also bilingual, Sanskrit, and perhaps a local vernacular language. Many of these grants have been made to religious institutions and to Brahmins. These grants range from small plots to large tracts, which were being donated by kings or by very rich people. And when we look at these land grants, they give us the text of the land grant, the content of the land grants. They give us a glimpse of rural life and what dues had to be paid by the villagers to now this new Doni who had been given this land by the king. Now, when we talk about land grants, we have to talk about Prabhavati Gupta. Now, Prabhavati Gupta, we know, donates land. We found some inscriptional evidence that Prabhavati Gupta was donating land to not only temples but also to learned Brahmins. Now, Dharma Shastras, of course, tell us that women cannot own land. So, how is Prabhavati Gupta donating land if she doesn't own any? Now, Prabhavati Gupta was an exception. She was extremely powerful woman. She was the daughter of Chandragupta II, one of the most powerful kings of the Gupta dynasty. She was married to the Vakataka king of the Deccan, and after her husband's death, she was also the regent to her son. So she really was an exceptional woman, and therefore, you know, uh, her land grants are considered so exceptional by historians. Perhaps Prabhavati Gupta making land grants also indicates that the Dharma Shastras were not always followed in every part of India. Now, the question is, why were these land grants given? Now, scholars uh, argue different points. Uh, s- some of them argue that this was a strategy to extend cultivation to new lands. So, hitherto, virgin lands were brought under cultivation, which obviously would mean that the king would be able to gain more. Sometimes land grants were given by kings to win allies. Others gave land grants to legitimize their rule, especially if they had usurped power from another dynasty. Other scholars argue that maybe giving the act of giving land grants was like presenting a facade of power if the king was growing weak. We see it, especially the land grants which are given during the later part of the Gupta rule. Um, the kind of language that is being used seems very hyperbolic. So scholars are assuming that because the kings at this point of time were in a weaker position vis-a-vis their samantas, they were kind of announcing that, okay, I'm giving this land grant as a way of showing that I'm still very powerful. We now come into towns and look at trade. New cities are emerging, commercial centers, administrative centers. Often they are located along important trade routes. So we have Puhar, which is a coastal town. A lot of shipping activity takes place from here. We have Ujjaini, as I've already mentioned earlier. It was along an important land trading route which connected southern and northern India. We had Mathura, which was right at the center of the Indo-Gangetic plains, and Takshila, which connected India to the larger Silk Route. What were urban populations like? So there was a mix of both elite and craftspeople. We have found NBPW, or Northern Black Polished Ware Pottery, which was a very fine grade of pottery. So perhaps this kind of pottery was being used, by the richer people living in the city. We have also found evidence of a large variety of goods made with different kinds of materials. So you have tools, weapons, jewelry, which were made of iron or copper, bronze, silver, shell, gold, and so on. We also have a lot of donor inscriptions, especially to temples, which mention washing folk communities, weavers, scribes, carpenters, potters, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, officials, religious teachers, merchants, and even kings. We also have evidence of shrenis or guilds, craft guilds or trade guilds, which organized and regulated production and the quality of the production. And on the other hand, they also looked after the needs of the members as well. Indian trade was quite widespread, not only within the Indian subcontinent but also far beyond. They traded in all directions. So we had trade links with Central Asia. In fact, they connected us to Europe as well, Southeast Asia, North Africa, and China. In Sangam texts, we find successful merchants are designated as Masattuvan in Tamil and Settis and Satvahas in Prakrit. And these merchants could grow to be enormously rich. Now, the items of trade were also mind bogglingly varied, but we can only name a few here. So, salt, grain, cloth, metal ores, finished products, stone, timber, medicinal plants, spices, especially pepper, was very highly demanded in the Roman Empire. Now, when we're talking about long distance trade, we have to talk about monetization or emergence of coins, because it is coins or currency that really facilitates, trade over long distances and also trade in high value items. So, the earliest punchmark coins that we find are uh, made in silver and copper. They facilitated trade and exchange. And when numismatists study coins, where coin hoards are found, they help us mark out commercial routes of those times. We have coins not only issued by kings but also merchants and bankers' guilds, and even tribal republics like the Yodhayas were minting their own coins. The Indo Greeks issued the first coins with names of kings on them, and later on, this practice was adopted by different Indian dynasties as well. The first gold coins were issued by the Kushanas and later the Guptas. The Kushana gold coins were almost of the same weight and value like that of the Indo Greek coins. Now, gold coins indicate enormous value of trade over long distances. We found a lot of coin hoards, which may reveal, which were important centers of exchange, how the routes were mapped out. But as we move further in this period, we see that by the 5th and the 6th century CE, we find less coins. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that empires were in decline and they didn't have enough money to mint gold? They didn't have enough gold sources to mint gold coins? Other scholars have argued that perhaps they were in circulation and maybe the empires were stable, which is why the people did not have to, hoard and hide the money. There are yet other scholars who say that maybe the trade routes had changed and we have not discovered those new trade routes. So perhaps an accidental find of coin hoards will actually redefine trade routes in the